All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I think it's safe to say if you're tuning in, you're probably knee-deep in those UPSC books.
Yeah, no doubt.
And if international relations happens to be your optional subject, well, then you're really in for a treat today.
Absolutely. We're diving into some pretty dense material.
Oh, yeah, we're tackling Edmund Burke.
That's right, his political philosophy.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. Ugh,
Another,
deep dive into some long-gone dude's ideas.
right, like, how is this going to help me with the UPSC?
Trust me, though, Burke's critiques on revolution, traditions, and even human rights, it's all surprisingly relevant to how we understand international relations even today.
Yeah, he really makes you think differently about some fundamental concepts.
Okay, so let's kick things off with Burke's take on the social contract. You know, that idea that society is basically just a big agreement we all signed,
Yeah.
like Locke and all that.
Right, the classic Locke-in view. Super influential, but Burke wasn't buying it.
So what did he think?
Well, for Locke, it's all about individuals coming together, agreeing to be governed for their own safety and all that. But Burke, he had a much more, I don't know, a much more interconnected view of society. There's this famous quote where he describes society as a partnership, get this, between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born.
Whoa, okay, that's a bit heavier than just signing on the dotted line, right?
Right. Suddenly, it's not just about me and my individual rights. It's like we inherit these obligations not just to people today, but to past generations.
And future ones too, right?
Exactly. That changes the whole game when you're thinking about international relations.
Yeah, I'm starting to see why Burke is considered such a big deal.
Oh, yeah, he really shakes things up.
But then there's this whole thing about him being skeptical of natural rights. Isn't that a bit radical?
It might seem that way at first glance, but Burke isn't saying rights don't exist. He's just questioning, well, where do they come from? He's really careful to distinguish between rights that come from a long tradition.
Okay, rights that have been around for a while.
Yeah, things that have actually worked for a society over time versus those rights that are based solely on, I don't know, you know, pure thought and reason.
So like rights that emerge from a people's history versus something that falls for just like dreams up.
You got it. And think about it. I mean, look around the world, right? This distinction Burke's making, it's playing out everywhere. Some cultures really put individual liberty above everything else, while others, they emphasize collective rights or duties you have to the state. You know, it makes you wonder why some rights become international law more easily than others, right? Burke really pushes you to think about that.
This is where it gets really interesting for a UPSC aspirant, right?
Yeah.
You're not just memorizing facts about international agreements. You're starting to see the bigger picture, the philosophies behind everything.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another one of Burke's big ideas. His suspicion of change, especially really fast, radical change driven by pure reason.
Oh, right. Burke, the skeptic of revolutions.
That's him. But why did he see pure reason as potentially dangerous? Well, this is crucial, especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC.
All right, help us understand this.
Because for Burke, reason, while powerful, it's got its limits. It can't grasp everything about how society actually works. He puts a lot of emphasis on what he calls prejudice. Now, hold on.
Okay, I'm going to be worried.
I know, but he doesn't mean prejudice in the negative way we use it today, not bigotry.
Okay, so what kind of prejudice are we talking about?
Think of it as this deep accumulated wisdom. It's the kind of knowledge that's baked into traditions, into institutions.
I see. So like those unwritten rules everyone in diplomacy knows but no one talks about.
Exactly. It's prejudice in action. This practical wisdom, this gut feeling that sometimes pure reason just misses.
I get it. So it's like how experienced diplomats know there are things you just don't say, even if logic says you should.
Precisely. And for Burke, the French Revolution was a perfect example of reason going off the rails. Those revolutionaries, they thought they could just scrap everything and rebuild society based on these abstract ideals.
Yeah, and how did that work out for them?
Not so well. But how does this apply to, international relations today? Because diplomacy seems like it needs logic to work.
Right. It seems super important.
Of course, logic is crucial, but what Burke is telling us is, hey, it's not the only thing at play. You look at international institutions, they're not just about signing treaties based on some perfect theory, right? They operate within this web of history of relationships.
And cultural differences too, right?
Absolutely. And don't forget those unwritten rules we talked about.
Right.
Trust, historical precedents, shared understanding, those are all products of prejudice in Burke's sense, and they're vital for any kind of global cooperation.
Wow, this is really giving me a whole new way to look at IR.
It's a different lens for sure.
Speaking of different ways of looking at things, Burke had some pretty strong opinions about who should be in charge.
Yeah.
He wasn't exactly a power to the people kind of guy, was he?
No, not really. He had this idea of a natural aristocracy.
All right, let's hear it.
Well, Burke definitely believed that not everyone is, cut out for leadership. But it wasn't simply about being born into a fancy family or having a ton of money. He had very specific qualities in mind for his ideal leader.
Don't leave us hanging. What were they?
Well, he really valued experience, a deep understanding of history, of statecraft, that wisdom you get through trial and error, all things that lead to good judgment. But maybe most importantly, he thought leaders need a strong sense of duty, a real commitment to something larger than themselves.
Interesting. It really makes you wonder what he'd think of our current world leaders, right? Does this idea of a natural aristocracy, does it hold any water today, or is it just a leftover from the past?
It's a good question. And it leads us to another, maybe even more controversial side of Burke.
Oh boy, here we go.
His views on citizenship and democracy. Now, this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I am definitely intrigued. But before we go there, maybe let's give everyone a minute to digest all of this. Burke can be a lot to take in.
Yeah, take a breath, everyone. We'll be back in a flash to unpack even more Burkean brilliance.
And trust me, it's worth the wait.
Okay, so back to Burke and his world, right? Now, this whole natural aristocracy thing, it's definitely one of his most, debated ideas, especially for you UPSC folks who are all about those democratic ideals.
Yeah, it definitely raises some eyebrows, right? Like, here we are in the 21st century talking about equality and all that, and Burke's over here advocating for a special elite.
It's a head-scratcher for sure, but it really makes you stop and think, okay, what does democracy actually mean, We got to remember, Burke was writing in a totally different time, but his ideas still make us think.
So are you saying there are times when a more limited government might actually work better?
I'm not saying that, but Burke, well, he might. He'd probably say that just having the right to vote, that doesn't automatically equal good government. He believed in a democracy, sure, but a limited one, where only people who were educated, who had property, those are the folks who should be voting.
Yeah, that's going to sound pretty elitist to a lot of people.
It definitely does, and by today's standards, yeah, it is. But Burke's point was that being a good leader takes more than just being popular, right? He was worried that if you just give power to the masses without, some checks and balances, well, you could end up with instability or even worse, tyranny.
So what's the takeaway for someone studying international relations, especially for the UPSC? Are we supposed to just throw out democracy?
No, not at all. But Burke's skepticism makes us ask some harder questions, like what qualities should we look for in our leaders? Is experience, wisdom, are those more important than just charisma? And how do we balance, people having a say with having a government that actually works?
These are questions any diplomat, anyone who wants to work in international relations, they're going to face these questions.
Every day. Think about the different types of leaders we see on the world stage, right? You've got those who are all about consensus building, and then you've got those who are, well, let's just say a little more forceful.
Yeah, some are definitely more my way or the highway.
Exactly. And Burke's ideas give us a way to analyze these approaches. He might argue that a leader who just plays to the crowd, relies on slogans and rallies without having that experience and wisdom to back it up, well, that could be disastrous, especially in international affairs. Can you imagine trying to deal with some complex geopolitical crisis based solely on what the polls are saying?
Oh man, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, not good. But let's get back to this limited democracy idea for a sec. Didn't Burke put a lot of stock in tradition, like
Sure.
established institutions and all that? How does that square with individual rights and freedom?
Yeah, isn't that a contradiction?
That's the big question, right? Burke truly believed that true freedom, it can only thrive when there's order, when there's stability. He saw institutions, customs, even those unspoken rules as like guardrails, to
Yeah.
protect us from like our own worst impulses or from the mob mentality.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot between individual liberty and what's good for everyone.
You got it. And for Burke, you hit that sweet spot through limited government, through emphasizing civic virtue, and through respecting the wisdom that's embedded in tradition. Now, you might not agree with all of his ideas, but he makes you think, right? He makes you think about the tension between what individuals want and what society needs.
And that is crucial for anyone trying to understand international relations,
Yeah.
right? This is about more than just knowing the names of treaties and who's allied with who. It's about getting those deeper philosophical ideas that shape how the whole world works.
Absolutely. Burke's work gives you that lens to understand how ideas, interests, institutions, how all of that stuff just crashes together to create the world of international relations.
It's like he's giving us a mental workout, you know, making us think beyond the easy answers and really wrestle with history, culture, even human nature.
And honestly, that's what makes IR so interesting, right? There are no easy answers. It's all about asking the right questions and being willing to have those tough conversations.
Speaking of tough conversations, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on. What are some of the main things they should take away from all of this, especially if they're prepping for the UPSC?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is this. Burke challenges us to think hard about the limits of reason when it comes to politics and really life in general. He's reminding us that tradition, history, even those deep-seated beliefs we call prejudice, they all play a huge role in how the world works, how nations interact with each other.
And sure, some of his views might sound a little outdated today,
Okay.
but he forces us to ask those big questions, right? About where rights come from, about what makes a good leader, about how we balance change and stability on a global scale.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So as you're studying for the UPSC, keep Burke in the back of your mind. He might just help you ace those exams, but more importantly, he'll make you a more thoughtful, insightful person. And that's really what matters in the long run.
Couldn't agree more. All right, now before we totally wrap up this deep dive into Burke, there's one more thing I want to touch on, something he thought was super important for good leadership, something he called moral imagination.
Oh, yeah, moral imagination. That's a juicy one. What did you think?
Well, it struck me as this quality that goes beyond just cold logic. It's like being able to really understand the emotional side of things, the historical context, the cultural stuff, almost like stepping into someone else's shoes, you know?
You nailed it. Burke believed that to be a true statesman, it takes more than just strategic thinking. It takes empathy, the ability to see things from multiple perspectives, and a commitment to doing what's right, not just what's easy or convenient.
It sounds almost like a superpower, but it's something anyone working in diplomacy and international relations, they need to develop this.
Absolutely. And it's something you can cultivate, through studying, through thinking deeply, through engaging with people who are different from you.
It's not like you're born with it. You got to work at it.
Exactly. It's something Burke himself, he really embodied this in his writing, in his own political life.
Well, I think Edmund Burke would be pretty happy with our deep dive today. We've explored his big ideas, wrestled with them, and hopefully got our listeners thinking in new ways.
That's the goal. And who knows, maybe some of these ideas will help a future diplomat ace their UPSC exams.
Fingers crossed. And for all of you out there on the UPSC journey, remember, knowledge is power. Keep digging, keep those brains engaged, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with your fellow UPSC warriors. We'll catch you next time. Okay, so we've talked about how Burke wasn't a fan of those big, sweeping changes, right? Like, he preferred a more, more careful approach to change.
Yeah, definitely.
But if pure reason isn't the answer, if it's not enough to really navigate all the complexities of international relations, what's the alternative? What does Burke offer?
Well, he puts a lot of emphasis on something he calls moral imagination.
Moral imagination. I like the sound of that.
Right. It's almost like a superpower for diplomats or something.
Oh, yeah. Okay, tell me more about this moral imagination thing.
So for Burke, effective leaders need more than just logic. They got to be able to see the bigger picture, grasp the emotional side of things, the historical context, all those cultural nuances.
Almost like stepping into someone else's shoes, right?
Exactly. You got to be able to see the world through different eyes. And for Burke, this was crucial for true statesmanship.
So it's not just about strategy, it's about doing what's right, even if it's tough.
That's Burke in a nutshell. He believed in a higher purpose, something beyond just winning the game of diplomacy.
I can see how this would be a huge help for those UPSC aspirants out there. I mean, they're not just being tested on facts and figures, right? They have to analyze complex situations, come up with solutions.
Exactly. And Burke gives them a way to think through these challenges. He reminds us that there are always consequences, things we don't anticipate. Those quick fixes, they can backfire big time.
It's like he's saying, slow down, think things through, learn from the past.
Right. Respect that accumulated wisdom, Sometimes the best way forward is the one that's been tried and tested.
So it's like a mix of caution and ambition, I guess. Cautious about the limits of our own reason, but ambitious to actually make the world better.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Burke might have been wary of revolution, but he wasn't against progress.
Progress with a purpose.
Exactly. Progress grounded in an understanding of history, of human nature.
Well, we've definitely given everyone a lot to think about. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners out there, especially those future diplomats gearing up for the UPSC exams?
Just remember, knowledge is power, but it's what you do with that knowledge that really matters. Burke pushes us to be more than just analysts. He wants us to develop that moral imagination, to think for ourselves, and to act on our principles.
Words to live by, really.
Those qualities, they'll serve you well, not just on exam day, but throughout your whole career.
Absolutely. And to all our listeners out there on that UPSC journey, keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and keep those brains firing on all cylinders. And hey, if you found this deep dive helpful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share this with your fellow UPSC warriors.
Spread the Burke wisdom.
We'll catch you next time.